evening. This is Desime Ramoso and welcome to my YouTube channel. So our lesson for today is all about microbes and the environment.
We're going to be looking at some of the different cycles that go on in the earth, and just a couple things to think about. If you were to take a pinch of soil, you may not think much of it, but there could actually be 1 billion microbes in that little tiny bit of soil. In that tiny little bit of soil, of those 1 billion microbes, there could be 10,000 different types or different species. And so while we don't see these with our naked eye, we do need to know that it's very important that these microbes work with us and all the other living organisms in order to recycle nutrients that are important, refresh our environment, clean up waste, and basically keep us alive. So what we can't see, it's a little hard to fathom sometimes, but hopefully after this class, you'll learn a little bit more. You already have learned a lot more about what that means. So when we look at the Earth's ecosystem, we want to kind of think about some terms here because a lot of times they're used, and we want to make sure we understand what it means. An ecosystem is basically a community of all the living organisms and how they interact with non-living factors in a certain space. So we could look at several different areas, but if we're looking at a certain area, we want to look at what's living, what's non-living, and how do they play a role against each other too, or with each other. And so thinking about, water and the different chemicals that we're going to be looking at in all the living organisms as a large group. So a lot of times you'll see this term biota in order to describe all the living organisms. We talked about the microbiota or microbiota on you as far as all the microbes that are living on a person as well. And so these interactions are very important, and they can change a lot based on different chemical and physical factors, but basically these systems all drive each other, and it's important to recognize how they do that. So first of all, a habitat is also the physical space or location where something resides or where we're looking at. And so if we think of a living organism, it's where they live. Usually there has to be quite a bit of water if microbes are going to be able to live in those areas, which is kind of what we're focusing on here. So a lot of times soil has enough of water content. Fresh water or marine water is where we're going to find a lot of microbes. Some can survive in drier environments, but most are going to need to have water at some point. As far as a community goes, if we're looking, we can look at different organisms living together, but if we think of a community of microbes, what else are they living with? What are they coming into contact with as well? So in any community that we would look at, the two major factors that we need to think about are energy sources and then chemical substances. Energy, all cells need energy, and we talked about how you can convert food energy into ATP. We also talked about photosynthesis, so something that would generate its own food, but basically all cells are going to need to either make their own food or obtain their own food to get energy. In that food, you have different chemicals that are important: carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, nitrogen, and other substances as well. And so these chemical substances need to get recycled, and oftentimes kind of their forms need to be changed so that one organism uses it a little bit differently than another. So when we look at kind of the pathway of energy, we can kind of look at producers, consumers, and decomposers. And so the producers are kind of what drive everything. They get their energy via sunlight. And so capturing that sunlight and using photosynthesis to actually make some sort of organic matter. We talked about making glucose, making a sugar. When that happens with a plant or a green algae or photosynthetic bacteria, basically they're making something like glucose in order to be able to use that for energy or to store it for energy later. Consumers, those are things that use the products of photosynthesis and maybe even consume the producers themselves. And we can look at primary consumers versus secondary consumers. So primary would be those that directly consume the producers. Secondary would maybe consume the primary, and so they would get that energy down the line. Decomposers, these are very important, and this is when we talk about a lot of microbes, but they're going to use the energy from the producers and the consumers after they die. And so recycling those nutrients and breaking down these substances so that they can get put back into systems is important as well. So during all of these processes, there's always some heat that is lost. It's not a perfect system, but generally to get the energy, we're looking at somehow obtaining basically these calories and these molecules that we can break down for energy. So this figure just kind of shows you your producers, and again, using sunlight, it doesn't necessarily just have to be trees, but that's one example. And so from that sunlight, they're getting their energy. We're losing some heat here in this case as well, but basically we have different things. Primary consumers are feeding on the producers. Secondary consumers might be eating the primary consumers, which in turn fed on the producer. But all of these are going to generate some heat loss, but then also feeders and decomposers, it's important to break these down after they have died. And so again, we see kind of a loss of heat, but we're also maintaining a lot of these factors that we'll be talking about in different cycles. So when we look at geochemical cycles, we're kind of looking at some of these basic elements. We're not looking at absolutely everything that life needs to live, but a lot of the ones that we're looking at here are very important. So when we look at life, we look at all life needs proteins, lipids, carbohydrates, and nucleic acids. We've touched on this briefly before. And so these things, these are just elements, these are just atoms, and they get passed on in one form to another. And so they don't really go away, they just get kind of transferred. And so keeping things in a cycle can be very important. And sometimes these cycles don't run like they should, and we don't necessarily, have a fair balance of what we should either, but generally, the cycles are important. So if we look at the carbon cycle here, a lot of carbon is going to travel as carbon dioxide, and so you should be a little familiar with that when we talked about photosynthesis. And so if you kind of think about, again, if you want to think about plants, that's fine, or you can think about microbes, but when they are photosynthesizing, they are actually using carbon dioxide. So if we exhale carbon dioxide, that's a waste product for us. Things that photosynthesize can actually use that. And what do they do with it? Well, in the presence of water and sunlight, they turn it into things like glucose, so other molecules. As well. That's aerobic respiration. Now there's different types, or aerobic organisms. There's different types, ways to do that, but that's kind of the general one that we usually talk about. And so thinking about some of the carbon cycles, photosynthesis, keep in mind we have the phytoplankton. So while we don't see them obviously like we see trees here, we have all these little single-celled kind of green algae and different organisms, different cyanobacteria that are capable of photosynthesis. So it's important to remember that all those bodies of water contain those little microbes that we're not going to see, but we need to know that are there. So sulfur is another component, and it's kind of important to realize, when we look at kind of these big building blocks, carbohydrates, proteins, etc., carbohydrates and lipids have only carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. But when we look at proteins especially, we may see some sulfur in there as well. And so if we look at kind of these organic molecules, now there's different forms as far as how we obtain that sulfur and how we kind of break down that sulfur as well. So you can see, anything that has an S in it contains sulfur, but there's different ways that animals can use it versus microbes. Sometimes it's a product that they're giving off, and it may combine with something else as well. And so not expecting you to know too much about the different types of sulfur, but just realize it's important, especially when it comes to some of the amino acids and some of the proteins that we need to build. So having it readily available in different forms in order to actually use it for different organisms is very important. When we look here at the nitrogen cycle, when I think of nitrogen, I think of proteins and also nucleic acids. We're not going to find nitrogen in carbohydrates or lipids, but it is important because every living organism needs protein. Every living organism has DNA, RNA. Nitrogen is part of ATP, and so it's important to kind of realize. And so it's hard to use as nitrogen gas, and that's how we find it in the atmosphere. And so we have a lot of different organisms that are called nitrogen-fixing organisms, like nitrogen-fixing bacteria. And so they are taking, you can kind of see here, they're taking this atmospheric nitrogen, and they're just changing the form. This form is getting changed to ammonia. So some other organisms can then take this ammonia and turn it into nitrate. And other organisms can turn it into nitrate also with a little different form here. Organic nitrogen, proteins, etc. But it's just changing. Different forms are available for different organisms. They can't all use it the same. So another cycle that we need to be concerned about is the phosphorus cycle. And when we think of phosphorus, we oftentimes see it written as PO4 as an ion. Sometimes we would just see it kind of as a P, as a symbol for phosphorus. But we need to keep in mind that we find it in ATP. When we cleave off the phosphate group, that's when energy is released. It has 3 phosphate groups, and we're really looking at cleaving off the one and putting it back together to assemble ATP. But also found in nucleic acids, DNA and RNA, and then different types of coenzymes. So it's important in a lot of chemical reactions and a lot of physical components of cells and energy for cells. And so you can see here different ways that phosphates actually are found. And so a lot of times they're found in rocks and minerals, they're found from agriculture, and they're washed off into waters. And so once they're in water, there can be a breakdown here of how they're changed and how they get recycled in here as well. Sometimes phosphates build up a little too much when it comes to industry, and so the balance of the water, phosphates in the water cycle, can sometimes be an issue as well. Then the oxygen cycle. Obviously, we need to breathe oxygen. Not every organism needs to breathe oxygen, but many do. And so this has allowed life to expand very quickly. And so when we think about production of oxygen, again, we want to think about green plants, it's fine, but we don't want to forget about algae, especially the little single-celled algae, and then cyanobacteria as well. And so we're going to find oxygen in all of these molecules that we look at, all of the organic molecules, water, carbon dioxide. You're going to see oxygen in a lot of different forms in that case. And so it does get recycled through, and it drives a lot of these processes as well.
So that could be all for today's vlog. I hope you enjoy watching. Thank you so much.